Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Classroom's course, History of Economic Thought, Part 1. I am your instructor, Robert Murphy, and now we're on Lecture 8, covering Jeremy Bentham. So here's an outline of what we're going to be covering for those following along on the PowerPoint. Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832. Some brief biographical remarks. He was an English philosopher. He was born in London, legal theorist and economist. And of course, his big claim to fame is that he is the founder of the modern philosophy of utilitarianism. And in fact, a lot of times people will use the adjective and say Benthamite utilitarianism. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about what does that mean if you qualify your type of utilitarianism by saying Benthamite. So I say he was born in London. His father was a wealthy lawyer. He's got a fascinating history, and if you have a lot of time and are interested in this stuff, I would encourage you to read Murray Rothbard's History of Economic Thought on Bentham and then also on James Mill, because Mill was one of the people that sort of was a disciple of Bentham, but it's a very subtle, nuanced story where Rothbard argues, I think with plenty of justification, that Mill actually was the more organized thinker, and for various reasons, though Mill wanted to not be in the spotlight and chose to try to advance other people but influence them, Ricardo, of course, being the other one. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to James Mill and Ricardo for this course. But the other problem with Bentham is he was not an organized writer, right? So he had a lot of he was productive, he cranked stuff out, but it was often you'd see references when people talk about him to say unpublished manuscript when they're citing things, or incomplete manuscript. All right, so even well after his death, a lot of his followers were still trying to organize his material and publish things posthumously. So some of his major works are Fragment on Government, which came out in 1776, Defense of Usury, 1787, and An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1832. So that Defense of Usury, I've included the whole thing. If you go to the syllabus under the selected readings, there's a link to the online Liberty Library version of it, so you can see the whole thing. It's not that long, and it's worth reading. And then Bentham's views on utilitarianism are laid out most comprehensively in the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Okay, I cannot talk about Bentham without mentioning the panopticon, because you always would hear about that, even though it's really, strictly speaking, not necessary if you're just talking about the evolution of economics. But this is a proposal he had. So in addition to his, let's say, philosophical writings and economic writings, Bentham also spent a lot of time advising governments, or writing pamphlets and things for trying to get governments to enact certain policies. And the thing that he's probably most famous for, just besides utilitarianism itself, is this idea of the panopticon. And so the basic idea is, for a very efficient way to run a prison, he was saying you just put somebody in the middle. What I'm showing here is a diagram of it. Now, this diagram by itself actually isn't that perhaps meaningful to you if you're looking at the PowerPoint slides. But the idea is it's a circular building, so all the prisoners are arranged like on the inside of the outer shell, if you will, around the edge of the prison, and then in the middle is the watchtower. And Bentham was just saying by various means you could architecturally design the thing such that with mirrors and so on, one person or few people could monitor a great number of prisoners. And the beauty of it, or the horror of it, depending on your perspective, is that the prisoners wouldn't know whether they were being watched or not, right? So if there's one person in the tower who's able, through a system of mirrors and so on, to look into the cells of lots of different people, then that one person can be monitoring them, and the people can't, for various reasons, like look and see if there's an eyeball staring at them. So at any given time, each prisoner thinks, I could be watched right now, I don't know. And so everybody behaves as if they were being watched. And so the idea is, oh, isn't this great? Look at how efficient this is, that with just one person's labor, we can monitor all these other people. So that's the basics of it. That's what everybody knows is the panopticon, and so you'll see references to it nowadays, even if there's some new report coming out talking about how government's spying on people or whatever, somebody might say, "Oh, it's the panopticon," and that's what they're talking about. That's the reference. What's interesting, if you go and read Rothbard's discussion of it, is he takes it a lot further than I've ever seen other writers do, and he digs up all kinds of stuff. And he says, look, it's not merely a proposal for prison reform, even though that's where a lot of conventional textbooks end with their treatment. But Bentham also thought this could be useful for reforming of the poor laws and what to do with indigent children and stuff like that. Well, let's grab them and put them to work in a workhouse, and we'll monitor them using the same principles that we thought would happen for a prison. So it gets creepier and creepier. And then the creepiest thing of all, and this isn't like original research Rothbard did. He was using other people's work on this, but again, this is very obscure that until I read Rothbard's treatment, I had never heard this before. It wasn't merely that Bentham was saying, hey, somebody in the government ought to be doing this, but Bentham himself was the one he pictured being in charge of running the panopticon and running, all these workhouses and stuff for poor children. So I can't really do it justice here. I just want to note that. And so if you're interested and want to read that further, go ahead and look it up. You guys know from my earlier lectures that sometimes I say, yeah, it's not that Rothbard said anything that's incorrect, but I kind of feel like, he's being a little bit harsh on this guy. In this case, I think Rothbard's not being too harsh at all. The stuff he dug up on Bentham, it's creepy the more you read about it when it comes to the panopticon and Bentham's remarks to his friends and letters and so on about, how he wishes he were in charge of this thing. So take that for what it's worth. Of course, as you can imagine, in the hands of Rothbard, he's saying this just shows you the bankruptcy of the utilitarian philosophy, that once you go down that path and throw out natural law and don't think there are any higher principles governing your behavior besides you just run a cost-benefit test, look at what happens. Okay, and Rothbard is not setting up a straw man, I should say. I mean, Bentham actually has thrown out any sort of reverence for natural rights, even sort of, I don't know if ridicule is the right word, but criticizing Adam Smith even. So I should say, to make sure you don't get confused here, Bentham started out as a pretty strong advocate of laissez-faire. He was very sympathetic to Adam Smith, credited Smith with influencing his own views. But then as his career progressed, he got more and more interventionist. And it wasn't just that he kept changing his policy prescriptions, but even the way he talked about Smith in print and his fealty, if you will, to sort of natural law principles, just over time, you could just see the evolution. So as you can imagine, Rothbard, who's a staunch advocate of natural rights, natural law, and thinks if you're going to be a free market libertarian, that's the proper foundation, not to just do an efficiency cost-benefit calculation. Rothbard thinks that that's not a coincidence, that Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, started out as a pretty hard-hitting laissez-faire guy, and then by the end of his career was writing stuff that's shocking. And I'll give you a specific example of that by the end of this lecture. Okay, so let's move on to utilitarianism. Now here, with the constraints of this course, all I can do for most of these things is just give you guys the bird's eye view, make sure I tell you all the stuff that everybody knows about these people, right? If you're ever going to talk about them, you got to know certain things. So that's what I'm doing here. Obviously, with a 30 or so minute sketch of Jeremy Bentham, I can't get into the weeds about the finer points of utilitarian theory. As you can imagine, there's all sorts of things that have been written on this, people trying to extend it, people critiquing it, people responding to the critiques, back and forth. All right, so I'm just going to give you the basics to at least give you a grounding in case you haven't formally studied this topic before. Now, the other difficulty is this word utility is used in economics, and not just in mainstream neoclassical economics, but also in Austrian economics. And obviously, it has something to do with utilitarianism, but the terms don't quite mean the same thing, and it's used in very different ways depending on the context and who the author is. And so let me just give you some examples to try to help you avoid confusion. All right, so one thing you need to be aware of is that when people use the word utility, even in economic science, over the history of economics, that term has meant something different depending on who's writing. So originally, the way Bentham uses it, he thinks of utility as a cardinal, quantifiable unit of happiness. And believe it or not, and I'll show you this when we get to them, even the early Austrians, even Bombaverk, for example, has passages where you can tell he thinks that utility is some measurable. I mean, it might not be measurable in the sense of in practice, can somebody use some kind of instrument and put it up against a person's head or put it into their nervous system or something and measure utils. But you can see that Bombaverk thinks, at least in some of his exposition, some of his numerical examples and so on, that it makes sense to talk about people having this quantifiable unit of something called utility. So nowadays, if people talk about Benthamite utilitarianism, that's what they mean by that term Benthamite, probably. They mean, when I say utility, I mean like people actually have units of this stuff, and it makes sense to talk about those things being measurable, at least in principle. In contrast, the way Ludwig von Mises or Murray Rothbard uses the term utility, it's an ordinal concept. And I don't want to get too technical here and really confuse you guys. Even if you look at utility theory in the hands of a microeconomist from an Ivy League school at this point, strictly speaking, in terms of normal standard consumer theory, ever since the work of Pareto and John Hicks, utility, even for those writers, those economists, it has an ordinal connotation. All right, so I will not talk about that anymore. Let me just talk about it in terms of like Bentham versus Mises and Rothbard, just because that'll be easier for you guys to understand. But I'm saying this is not a mainstream economics versus Austrian economics discussion. This is more early economics versus later economics discussion, if you follow what I'm saying. So the distinction, again, is when we use the word utility, if we say, for example, oh, the reason that person gave up the $10 bill in order to acquire that lunch is that the person got more utility from the lunch than he got from the $10 bill. Okay, so Bentham would be fine with that sentence, and so would Ludwig von Mises, or so would Murray Rothbard, but they mean different things by it. That Bentham would think that means, oh, we could in principle at least measure how many utils the person has, or units of utility, the person has from the $10 bill, and if he gives it away, now he has less utility. The number of utils accruing to him is lower. And then, but if he gets that lunch, now he's got more utility, and he's now at a higher level of utility than he was before. And in principle, we could measure those things, and it's just adding it up. Now the number of utils is higher than it was before. And again, that's even how Bombaverk was writing, at least in the 1880s. In contrast, if Murray Rothbard says, yep, that person gave up the $10 bill in order to acquire the lunch because the lunch gave him more utility, that is just shorthand for saying he prefers the lunch to the $10 bill, right? So it doesn't mean anything more than it doesn't imply there's some quantifiable number of utils. And if that seems weird to you, forget about utility. Just think about it in terms of friendship. It makes sense to rank my friends, right? I could say Mary is my best friend and John is my second best friend. For me to say that does not imply that there's such thing as friendship units, and that in principle I could measure how many friendship units do I have vis-a-vis Mary and vis-a-vis John, and then say, oh, Mary's got 32% more friendship units with me than John does, and that's why she's a better friend. Okay, so make sure you understand that distinction. We'll come back to this probably several times in this course and in the next one if you take part 2. But I just want to point it out here, since Bentham obviously is the one who really started this principle in terms of the quantifiable version of it. Oops, okay, I got it. Oh, yes, here we go. Benthamite versus Mises Hazlitt use of consequentialism in economics. Okay, so again, I confused myself for a second. There's so many distinctions. I thought that I had jumped ahead in the PowerPoint, but I didn't. So here, the second bullet point, again, I'll read it out. It's the next distinction I'm making is the Benthamite version of utilitarianism in ethics versus the Mises or Henry Hazlitt use of utilitarianism as an ethical theory. So again, don't be confused. You can use it in terms of economics, right? We can say Jim gave up the $10 bill in order to acquire the lunch because the lunch gave him more utility than the $10 bill. That's not saying what Jim just did was moral, all right? Or at least that we would need more information to make that conclusion. As economists, we can just value free in terms of economic science, just explain consumer behavior by saying people maximize utility or they take actions that increase their utility. They try to achieve the highest possible position on their preference scales, right? Those are all equivalent ways of speaking, and there's no moral connotation to those statements. Just like if I said nature abhors a vacuum or something as a physicist, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's the way the world works. So by the same token, an economist could say, explaining tobacco prices or explaining the price of cigarettes or beer or whatever, you say, oh yeah, the reason the person gave that $20 bill for that bottle of alcohol is because he got more utility from the alcohol than from the money. That doesn't mean we're therefore christening that as a moral action. We're just saying that it is what it is. And if you want me to explain prices, I got to bring in the fact that people have utility that some people get from things that some people think are not good for them. Okay. But now that term is often used in ethics. And so clearly Jeremy Bentham is a utilitarian in ethical theory. It's not just that he used it for consumer theory in terms of economics to explain market prices. He also intended it to be something that explained morality and explained also government policy and how it should be conducted. And so what may surprise you if you didn't know this is that also Ludwig von Mises and Henry Hazlitt advanced what they would have called utilitarianism or some version of it, but they by that term they meant something different. Right? And I would say it's more accurate, or at least it's less liable to confusion, if you think that what Mises and Hazlitt were talking about was consequentialism, meaning the way you ultimately determine whether you support or should support a government policy or whatever is to look at the consequences it has on human beings, and that's really the yardstick. Okay, as opposed to having, some independently derived system of morality that is not directly tied to impacts on human beings. All right, so that's, again, be careful that that's the way it's used. So we're going to see in a minute, the way Bentham uses it, he's saying those, like if you're talking about government policy, if a government policy promotes more aggregate pleasure than pain, then it's a good policy. It ought to be implemented. And so that implies that you're, in a sense, adding up utility across people and seeing are we increasing aggregate utility or not. Whereas for Mises, he doesn't believe that even makes sense, that you can't compare utility across people. It's not a quantifiable thing, just like it makes sense for any individual to rank her friends from her best friend down to her worst friend, her best enemy. I don't know if you want to do it that way. And you could do it for somebody else, right? You could talk about Mary's friends ranked from best friend to worst friend and Jim's friends ranked from best friend to worst friend. But it would make no sense to say, oh, well, what if, Johnny used to be Jim's third best friend and now he stops being friends with him and now he's Mary's 15th best friend. What's happened to total friendship in this three-person community? Has it gone up or down? That's a nonsense question. It's not merely that it would be hard in practice to measure it and figure it out. It's that doesn't even mean anything. Whereas we can understand what we mean by saying these two people have their friends ranked. It makes no sense to try to make those rankings comparable to each other. Okay, so that's the way that Mises uses the term utility, that he thinks, yes, in terms of economics, I like to use that term. It makes sense to say individuals rank things subjectively in an ordinal fashion. So again, ordinal means first, second, third, whereas cardinal is like 1.7, 2.9. You can do mathematical operations, arithmetical operations on cardinal numbers. You can't do them on ordinal numbers. It makes no sense to say what's first plus fourth. It's not fifth. But it's not merely you don't know. It doesn't even mean anything. Whereas you can say what's 1.7 plus 8.645. That makes sense. You can figure out the answer. But to say what's third plus eighth, that doesn't even mean anything. Okay, so again, Mises, when you read his formal description of his views on morality and ethics and what sort of principles should guide government policymakers, he ultimately thinks man is the measure of all things, that ultimately it's human welfare that determines whether something is good or bad from a social point of view. So in that sense, you could say he's a utilitarian, but that's liable to confusion because it's certainly not a Benthamite utilitarianism, because Bentham really thought you somehow figure out, is this government policy going to create more aggregate happiness, where in principle we can measure in quantifiable units the happiness of each person or the pain inflicted on each person. Okay, also within the Benthamite framework, and Rothbard gets into this, there's you could call it a distinction between personal versus social utilitarianism. So on the one hand, it's like if you're talking about an individual, Bentham might say each person acts so as to increase his pleasure and avoid pain. And so it's a situation where you're almost getting into a tautology. Like, do you just mean, like, if in other words, if anything a person did, like even if a person goes to the gym and lifts a lot of weights, and you could say, wow, that was more painful than if they sat on the couch eating Cheetos and watching TV. So did he just violate Bentham's description? And you could say, well, no, the person doesn't mind the physical pain in his muscles because he's knowing that, oh, I'm going to get pleasure from being all ripped up and walking around with huge muscles. And so there's a sense in which you wonder, in some versions, is this just a tautology, and it's just a way of saying, for example, in consumer theory, it really is a tautology, and Mises or Rothbard wouldn't apologize for that. They would say, yeah, we start with axioms and logically deduce things, and those are necessarily true, and so it is true by construction to say an individual goes in the marketplace and buys the things that give him the most utility, at least in expectation. And so whether that means a person goes and buys Bibles or a person goes and buys heroin needles, each person is doing what gives him the most utility in his own expectation according to his own preferences. But Bentham obviously doesn't mean that, because if he were just putting his stamp of approval on everything in the world, that wouldn't get us anywhere. Right? If Bentham said, no matter what, everything's always great and it's completely moral because everyone just maximizes utility as best he can at the moment of decision, well, so there is that tension as well. But beyond that, I'm saying there's the personal versus social, that you can talk about each individual acting, to say what's moral for an individual. Well, is it what promotes his own happiness? It's not as clear. But socially, like, what should the government do? Clearly, Bentham says the government should do things that promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay, so this principle of pleasure versus pain, here we have an excerpt from, and in the notes, I give longer quotations from Bentham's work on utilitarianism. All right, so again, so you're not confused, the syllabus, I give a link to his defense of usury. I don't quote from that in the notes for this lecture. In the notes, I'm just quoting from his much longer work. I'm going to give a link to it if you want to go look it up, but the defense of usury is not that long, so you could just sit there and read through the whole thing if you wanted. Okay, pleasure versus pain. This is Bentham. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, and on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, and all we say, and all we think. Okay, and then there's what is the philosophic calculus. So this principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, that's often how people would summarize if you said, hey, in just a few words, what did Bentham say the government ought to do? So, adopt policies that promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So number one, Bentham actually didn't invent that phrase. That he got that from Hutcheson. All right, and Bentham acknowledges that. It's not like he was a plagiarist. He admitted that he was getting it from Hutcheson. The other thing is, and plenty of people have pointed this out, by itself, that phrase is useless. Even if you thought it made sense to say there was a quantifiable utils for each person, and that those units of utility were comparable across people. Just like, for example, it makes sense to say, how many kilograms does this person weigh? That's a quantifiable number. And you could say, how many kilograms does that guy over there weigh? And kilogram is intersubjectively meaningful, right? This guy's kilograms are the same thing as that guy's. And so you could compare the two numbers and say, who weighs more? Or you could add them together and say the weight of these two guys put together is such and such. Whereas philosophically, it's not obvious you can do that with utility. But suppose you could. Still, it's not obvious what it would mean to do a policy that promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Even, switch to weight. You could say promote policies that promote the greatest weight for the greatest number. It's not clear what that means. Does it mean you maximize total weight? What if there's a policy that you could have twice as many people, but they all weigh 1/3 as much? Or you see what I'm saying? Like total weight would have gone down, but there's more people. Or what if the other way around? What if you cut the people in half, but their total weight was more than double? All right, so now you lost half the people, but the total weight's higher. Does that mean what you should do? So if it's not even clear, what I'm getting at is it's not obvious what you're maximizing, even if you thought it was a mathematically tractable variable. Okay, so another way of putting it is, even if you thought things were measurable, are you maximizing like the median utility? Are you maximizing the mode? Are you maximizing the mean? It's not obvious. What if you could make 90% of the people a lot better off, but 10% had to live in slavery to do that? Would that be maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number? It's not obvious. All right. So when it comes to pain and pleasure, Bentham had 7 what he called circumstances that would help you evaluate them. And so they're intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, propinquity or remoteness, fecundity, purity, and extent. And that last one meaning that is the number of persons to whom it extends. Okay, so, Bentham wasn't a fool. He understood that perhaps somebody might choose to start listening to classical music rather than eating a donut. And so there's a sense in which you might say, well, how do you even compare those two things? They're different types of pleasures. And so he would say that, well, the classical music, it's a pure pleasure, and it's fecund, right? Like it's likely to instill in you a desire to hear more classical music down the road or whatever. So it's, maybe you want to do that. Now, I guess you could say by the same token, if I eat a donut, maybe I get a taste for sweets and I want to eat more donuts and it's pleasurable. So it's difficult to understand or to really avoid just pure hedonism. And some would say, right, that's the whole point. This is pure hedonism. And there are passages, again, we can't get into with the time constraints, where if you read Rothbard, Bentham comes out and says things that you would think he wouldn't want to say. But he bites the bullet, as it were, and says, nope, this is my principle, and yep, it leads in certain circumstances to these implications, and I'm okay with that. He says at places that, with his panopticon and so on, that, you might say, are these people going to be reduced to just beasts working or whatever? And, I don't care. As long as they're happy, who cares whether we just consider them to be machines or whether they're not really men anymore? What's the difference about a label? As long as they're happier than they were before, I've done them a service. Right? So I'm paraphrasing, but he says words to that effect. Okay, so let's now, in the remaining few minutes here, turn to his economic writings. So his most famous work that's just purely economic is his Defense of Usury. And so here, as you can see, if you're following on the PowerPoints, that it was a letter to Adam Smith, is like the way it was presented. And what Bentham does in this, this was early on in his career, and this is when he was still pretty laissez-faire, when he still was inspired by Adam Smith and was a big advocate of liberty. And so Bentham has a pretty hard-hitting defense of usury. That it's pretty full-throated. There's no qualifications. It's not saying, oh, well, as long, it's okay if they charge 8% interest. So if the government wants to cap interest at 6%, I think it should be 8 or 9, because that's no, it's not like that. It's saying very principled things, like what right does the government have to interfere with voluntary transactions, right? That how is it hurting someone to borrow at what we consider to be an unconscionably high rate of interest? If he agreed to it, that means he must prefer to get the loan at the high rate of interest than to not get it. Presumably, if somebody else were willing to lend him money at a lower interest rate, he would have gone there himself. So if we outlaw usury, all we're really doing is saying some people who wanted to voluntarily borrow money at a high rate now have to go without the loan at all. So it's not clear how we're helping them. They don't want our help in that manner. Okay, so it was things like that. I'm paraphrasing, but it was arguments like that. So it was pretty hard-hitting. However, the last thing we'll talk about here, by the end of his career, he had become much more interventionist. And again, Rothbard thinks that's partly because of the impact of his utilitarian ethical system, that he no longer had principles guiding him. It was just, hey, whatever's expedient, and that's not really a useful way to steer your ship through the course of public policy. You're going to end up reaching absurd conclusions if you don't have any solid bedrock principles. Again, that would be like a Rothbardian critique. But whatever you say psychologically about how we got there, whether you think utilitarianism is a good philosophy or not, it's undeniable that Bentham started out as a pretty consistent, hard-hitting, laissez-faire advocate, and then later on had written stuff like this. So this is Bentham from an essay called Circulating Annuities. So this is Bentham. No addition is ever made to the quantity of labor in any place, but by an addition made to the quantity of money in that place. In this point of view, then, money, it should seem, is the cause of labor and general wealth. Okay, so that's pretty much the opposite of the standard classical view of production and wealth and the quantity of money, as we've seen. Hume thought that any quantity of money is optimal, right? Just prices adjust and so on. And really, what makes you wealthy, and Adam Smith picked this up as well, that was one of the flaws of mercantilism. It was not the accumulation of money per se that made the nation rich or poor. It was the real flow of output that they could get to consume. That's really what the measure of income was, I guess. And then wealth would be, the quantity of real goods that you have at your disposal. If you just have a big pile of gold coins, but nobody can make any food, that doesn't really help you. You're going to starve to death. So it's ironic that by 1800, Bentham was writing things that completely flew in the face of some of the best contributions of classical economics. All right, so that's our time for today. This was a necessarily brief glimpse of the thought of Jeremy Bentham. So he was incredibly important in the development of ethics and economic science for his discussions of this concept of utility. Having acknowledged that, there are plenty of people, especially Murray Rothbard, who think that it was not a good contribution, that he would have put in a lot of things that ended up leading economic science down the wrong path and that were horrible in terms of ethical philosophy. So, be that as it may, this is the work and the thought of Jeremy Bentham, and I will see you guys next time.